On a cold winter morning in 1944, when the war had already begun to tilt against Germany, a strange sight rolled out of a Luftwaffe hangar somewhere in occupied France. The airfield was quiet except for the slow echo of boots striking the frozen ground and the dull hum of an aircraft engine warming up. Mechanics stood still, their breath turning white in the morning air, eyes fixed on the machine that looked nothing like any aircraft they had ever prepared for flight. It was a fighter, sleek and sharp like the ones they had serviced 100 times before, but its color was wrong. It was not gray, not green, not the menacing black of night interceptors. It was painted in a pale shade of pink, so soft it almost looked white under the dim morning sky. The pilot, a young test officer with a calm but tense expression, climbed into the cockpit while a small group of engineers and officers watched from a safe distance. No one spoke. Even among men who had seen experimental aircraft before, this looked absurd. It looked like a mistake. Someone finally whispered, half mocking, half in disbelief, "Why pink?" The engine roared to full power, shaking frost off the wings. The pink aircraft started to roll forward, its landing gear kicking up dust and bits of snow as it gained speed. The officers turned their collars against the wind, eyes following the plane as it lifted off the ground and began to climb into the gray morning haze. For a few seconds, the strange color seemed to make the aircraft glow softly against the dull sky. Then, as it climbed higher into the thin light, something happened that made even the most hardened engineer blink in surprise. It began to disappear. At first, they thought it was a trick of the eyes. But as the aircraft rose above a thin layer of clouds, the soft pink surface faded into the atmosphere until it was almost gone. The observers on the ground looked around, confused. They could hear the faint echo of the engine, but their eyes could no longer find the shape of the plane. One of them raised binoculars, searching the sky, then slowly lowered them and said quietly, "I cannot see it anymore." What they had just witnessed would become one of the strangest and most symbolic moments in the Luftwaffe's final years. The color that looked childish and foolish had done something extraordinary. It had made the plane almost invisible. Hours earlier, inside a small workshop near the airfield, a group of German engineers had been studying a captured Allied reconnaissance aircraft. It was one of the British photographic Spitfires that had fallen into German hands after a forced landing months before. Its surface, to their amazement, had traces of a similar pale paint. At first, the Germans had assumed it was some kind of undercoat or maintenance layer. But when reports surfaced that the Allies had used unusual colors to disguise aircraft at dawn and dusk, curiosity spread among Luftwaffe engineers. They began to wonder if there was something more to it. Now, as their own pink-painted aircraft vanished into the morning light, that curiosity turned into uneasy respect. They were not mocking anymore. They were studying. The pilot's voice crackled faintly through the field radio, reporting that visibility from above was perfect and that the Allied observation posts below had not spotted him during his test run. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing to hear rumors about British tricks. It was another to see the same principle work under their own command. In the sky, the pink plane turned gracefully, its shape melting in and out of the haze. The soft color blended perfectly with the faint light of the rising sun. It looked as if the air itself had swallowed the machine. The officers on the ground stared upward in silence, unable to decide whether they were witnessing a technical marvel or a bitter reminder that the enemy had discovered something before them. The young pilot, circling at a low altitude, was beginning to feel the strange beauty of what he was doing. The paint that looked laughable on the ground had turned him into a ghost in the air. His instruments glowed softly in the dim cockpit. The rising sun painted the sky with shades of orange and violet, and for a moment, his own wings seemed to dissolve into the color of the horizon. He later wrote in his flight notes that it felt like flying inside light itself. When he landed, the engineers rushed toward the aircraft, their breath quick and white in the cold air. One of them pressed a hand against the wing and muttered, "It works. It actually works." Another, older man, perhaps a scientist from Berlin, only nodded slowly. He did not look proud. He looked thoughtful. "Do you understand what this means?" one of the officers asked quietly. They figured this out long ago. We are only now discovering it. The others said nothing. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the smell of hot oil mixing with winter air. In that silence, they all understood what had just happened. The mighty Luftwaffe, once confident in its dominance, had just borrowed a small piece of the enemy's genius. The experiment had not been an act of arrogance. It was an act of realization. That absurd color, once laughed at, had become a symbol of something much deeper, a reflection of how the war had turned. The Germans were no longer setting the pace. They were learning from the very enemy they had once believed inferior. The pale pink aircraft was not a secret weapon. It was a confession painted in light. As the sun climbed higher, the strange aircraft was pushed back into the hangar. The frost began to melt around its wheels. Soldiers and technicians passed by, still glancing at it, unsure if they should take pride or feel shame. One mechanic whispered to another, "It is beautiful, is it not?" The other replied softly, "Yes, but it is not ours." In that small airfield, far from Berlin, far from the front, a group of engineers and pilots had seen something that changed how they thought about the war. They had always believed strength came from armor, speed, and firepower. But now they had seen that invisibility could come from something as simple as color and light. And as the day went on, the pink plane sat quietly inside its hangar, its surface catching the dim glow of the afternoon sun. It no longer looked absurd. It looked peaceful, almost innocent. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Because deep down, every man who had watched that morning flight understood the truth. The Germans had not built that color. They had borrowed it. They had not invented invisibility. They had only just begun to understand it. They were not trying to hide from the enemy. They were trying to understand why they had never seen him coming. The discovery happened almost by accident. It was early in 1944, and the war had reached a point where every scrap of captured material mattered. Supply lines were breaking, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe's confidence had started to crumble under the growing weight of Allied air power. Yet, in a quiet corner of a captured French airfield, surrounded by broken machinery and half-buried hangars, a group of German engineers stood staring at something that seemed so unimportant at first that no one even bothered to take notes. It was a damaged Allied aircraft, dragged in by a recovery team a few days earlier. The British markings were faded and half burned away, but the design was unmistakable. A reconnaissance plane, one of the fast and unarmed types the Allies had been sending deep over German territory. It had landed hard in a field outside Brest after engine failure, and though the pilot had been taken prisoner, the real curiosity lay in what remained of the plane itself. The men circled the wreck like hunters examining an unfamiliar animal. Its wings were smooth, stripped of weapons, its body carefully polished. One of the engineers crouched near the fuselage and brushed his fingers across the paint. "Strange," he murmured, rubbing the pale dust between his thumb and finger. "It is not gray. It is not blue either. What is this?" At first glance, the color looked almost white, but when the sunlight hit it at a certain angle, a soft pink hue shimmered beneath the surface. The chief engineer, a tired man named Schreiber, frowned and called for a technician. "Check the underlayer. It may be primer," he said. They believed it was some kind of unfinished coating, perhaps a maintenance color applied before final painting. But when they scraped deeper, they realized the entire surface was painted that way, deliberately. "It makes no sense," one of the younger men said. "Who would paint a plane this color? It is like painting a target on it." No one laughed. There had been a time when such remarks would have drawn a chuckle or a boastful reply about German engineering superiority. But that time had passed. The hangar was filled with silence and the dull sound of dripping water from a leaky roof. The war had changed their tone. The engineers who once spoke with pride now worked with quiet anxiety, their confidence replaced with a hunger for understanding. By afternoon, word of the strange aircraft had reached the Luftwaffe's local command. A few officers arrived to see it for themselves. They stood beside the engineers, their breath misting in the cold air, and stared at the pinkish wreckage. One officer, a pilot who had flown dozens of missions over the channel, leaned closer, and shook his head. "This cannot be camouflage," he said. "It is nonsense. You would see it for miles." But Schreiber was not convinced. "Perhaps," he replied, "we are seeing it wrong." He had the remains cleaned and brought inside one of the larger hangars, away from the wind and dust. The technicians worked carefully, removing dirt and burned fragments until the aircraft's strange sheen was revealed more clearly. In the dim light, the pale pink tone seemed to blend into the shadows around it. From certain angles, it looked almost invisible. They took photographs, samples, and measurements. Reports were written in tidy German handwriting, full of uncertainty. The word unbekannte Tarnung, unknown camouflage, appeared several times. A few days later, a meeting was held at the airfield's operations room. The long wooden table was crowded with maps, camera negatives, and scraps of paint taken from the captured plane. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air. The officers sat with weary expressions as Schreiber presented his findings. He spoke quietly, carefully explaining how the color seemed to change depending on the light. It reflected the sunrise in a way that softened the plane's outline. It was, in a strange way, beautiful. When he finished, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then an older colonel leaned back in his chair and said, "You believe this child's color hides a plane?" His tone carried more exhaustion than mockery. Schreiber hesitated before answering. "I believe it might," he said. "And I believe the British have been using it for some time." A murmur passed through the room. Some men shook their heads. Others stared at the samples on the table with thoughtful frowns. Everyone knew how desperate things had become. The Allies ruled the skies. The Luftwaffe's resources were stretched thin. If the enemy had found even the smallest advantage, it needed to be understood, copied if possible. By the end of the meeting, it was decided that an experiment would be conducted. A single aircraft would be repainted using the same shade, and a controlled flight would be made to test visibility under different light conditions. The idea was not officially approved by Berlin. It was too minor for higher command to care, but on the ground, the men treated it like a final chance to prove that they still had something left to discover. When word of the plan spread through the base, reactions were mixed. The pilots joked about it at first, calling it the pink ghost. But beneath the laughter there was something else, a quiet, unspoken feeling that this test was more than just another experiment. It was a sign of how far they had fallen. A few years earlier, Germany had been leading the world in aviation innovation. Now they were learning from their enemies, copying ideas, searching for anything that might delay the inevitable. On the day the plane arrived, the hangar smelled of chemicals and fuel. The aircraft chosen for testing was an older reconnaissance model, stripped of guns to save weight. The mechanics worked through the night, layering the paint with careful strokes, just as it had been applied on the British plane. When the morning light finally touched the wings, the color looked almost ethereal, soft, glowing faintly like the first light of dawn. A few officers stood near the hangar door watching in silence. One of them spoke in a low voice. "If this works," he said, "it will not win us the war. But perhaps it will help us understand how we lost it." The others said nothing. They just watched the pale shape of the aircraft, its wings catching the weak sunlight, and for the first time in months, there was something fragile in the air that almost felt like hope, thin, trembling, and uncertain. But underneath that faint spark of curiosity, everyone felt the same shadow. They were no longer inventors. They were imitators. They were no longer ahead. They were trying to catch up. And somewhere deep inside, they all knew that this strange pink plane, born from the remains of an enemy machine, was not just another test. It was a mirror showing them how much the balance of the skies had already changed. The morning chosen for the test looked more like a painting than a battlefield. The sky above the airfield was still a pale gray, touched with the first soft hints of gold from a rising sun. The ground shimmered with frost, and the air was so still that even the sound of boots crunching on the frozen soil echoed across the open field. Every breath turned to mist. Mechanics moved quietly, speaking in low voices, their gloved hands trembling slightly from the cold. They all knew that this test was something different. It was not another mission, not another patrol. It was an experiment, a fragile act of curiosity in a war that had already drained the world of wonder. At the center of the airfield stood the modified reconnaissance plane, an Arado 234, stripped of weapons and polished to a soft, ghostly shine. The paint, that strange Allied-inspired color, looked almost white under the dim light. But as the horizon began to glow pink with the approach of dawn, the aircraft seemed to change before their eyes. The pale tone of its body melted into the colors of the sky until it was hard to tell where the wings ended and the air began. The same officers and engineers who had laughed when the idea was first suggested now stood silently, unsure if they were witnessing genius or madness. The pilot, a calm and serious man named Feldman, adjusted his gloves and climbed into the cockpit. He had flown hundreds of hours in every kind of weather, but this morning felt different. There was a strange quietness inside him, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is part of something rare. He closed the canopy, checked his instruments, and gave a small wave to the ground crew. The engine coughed, then roared to life, breaking the stillness. Smoke swirled around the plane's tail as it began to roll down the runway. The pinkish aircraft picked up speed, its wheels rumbling over the frosty surface. For a brief moment, as the sun broke over the horizon, the color of the plane and the color of the sky became one. The observers squinted, shielding their eyes, as the aircraft lifted gracefully into the air. It climbed steadily, its shape small and sharp against the morning glow. Then something unexpected happened. As it rose into the thin layer of mist that hung just above the treetops, the plane seemed to melt into the haze. One moment it was there, shining softly in the new light. The next it was gone. On the ground, the men looked up in confusion. The radio operator called for a position report, his voice trembling slightly. The pilot's calm reply came back through static. Altitude, 2000. Visibility excellent. I can see everything. How do you read me? But the observers could not see him. They scanned the sky with binoculars, moving side to side, searching for the faintest outline of wings. There was nothing, only the hum of the engine, distant and unreal, like the sound of a bee lost in the wind. One of the younger engineers turned to Schreiber, the senior officer overseeing the test, and said softly, "It has vanished." Schreiber did not answer. He simply lowered his binoculars and stared at the horizon, his expression unreadable. Pink should have stood out like a flare. Instead, it had vanished into the very light that should have revealed it. Up above, Feldman continued to circle. From his position, he could see the fog spread across the fields like thin silk. The rising sun painted the clouds in soft tones of rose and gold. When he looked at his own wings, he noticed something strange. The color that had looked so awkward and childish on the ground now reflected the light in a way that blurred its shape completely. The edges of the wings dissolved into the morning sky. For the first time in his flying career, he felt as if he was part of the air itself. He spoke into the radio again, reporting his position and the lack of visibility from below. The crew on the ground, still unable to see him, exchanged glances of disbelief. The test had worked, perhaps too well. Minutes passed before Feldman brought the plane around for landing. As the pink aircraft descended, it began to reappear gradually, its form emerging from the haze like a ghost stepping into daylight. The men below stood motionless as it touched down gently and rolled to a stop. When the engine shut off, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. The pilot stepped out, his face pale from the cold and the excitement. "It works," he said simply, his voice low but clear. The words hung in the air. The ground crew surrounded the aircraft, touching its wings as if to make sure it was real. There was something unsettling about the quiet beauty of it. The color that had once seemed laughable had just outsmarted the eyes of every man watching. Schreiber walked slowly toward the plane. He looked at the fading sky, then back at the pink surface that now appeared dull under the full daylight. "So," he said softly, almost to himself, "the British were not fools after all." His tone was not bitter. It was thoughtful, heavy with realization. One of the younger officers, still trying to process what he had seen, asked, "Do we report this to Berlin?" Schreiber shook his head. Not yet, he said. They would never believe it. Let's test again first. The men laughed quietly, but it was a hollow laugh. No one could deny what they had witnessed. In a single morning, an idea they had mocked had turned into something undeniable. The pink plane had not been a joke. It had been a lesson. As the mechanics began to refuel the aircraft for another run, the frost on the runway melted into thin streams of water. The sunlight grew stronger, washing away the mist, and the strange color on the plane now looked ordinary again, just a pale, faded pink on metal. But in their minds, none of them would ever see that color the same way again. Feldman stood near the wing, wiping his gloves clean. It is strange, he said to no one in particular. The color that hides me in the air makes me feel more seen than ever. The others looked at him, puzzled, but said nothing. Perhaps he meant that for a moment, up there in that invisible space, he had felt connected to the very secret they were chasing, the reason their enemies had stayed one step ahead for so long. The test had been simple: take off, climb, circle, report. But what it revealed was something larger than any technical success. It showed them that the sky itself could be used as camouflage if one only understood its light. And that morning, as the sun climbed over the ruined airfield, even the most skeptical officers knew they had just witnessed something that went beyond paint and metal. It was as if the air had swallowed their pride and returned only truth. The truth that sometimes, to see clearly, one had to learn from the very thing one refused to believe. The discovery did not come with excitement or victory. It came with silence. After the pink aircraft's first successful test, the engineers and scientists gathered in a dimly lit room inside the hangar, surrounded by charts, photographs, and notebooks filled with hurried notes. The morning sun had risen higher, washing the world outside in a soft golden light, but inside that room, there was only the dull hum of a small generator and the scratching sound of pencils on paper. The air smelled of oil, paint, and old metal. These men were not celebrating what they had seen. They were trying to understand it. The scientists began by recording altitude data, angles of light, and levels of visibility at different times during the test. They measured everything: temperature, wind direction, even the moisture in the air. Every detail mattered now. The pink plane had vanished into the sky not by accident, but by something that looked disturbingly like science. Schreiber stood near the window, arms crossed, watching as one of his assistants drew lines on a transparency chart. "Show me again," he said. The assistant nodded and held the chart up to the light. A faint pattern appeared, curves and lines representing the way light scattered through air at different times of day. The younger man explained, in a careful voice, that at sunrise and sunset, the lower part of the sky was filled with diffused light. That light scattered more red and pink wavelengths, which softened contrast and made edges disappear. Schreiber listened quietly. Then he said something that no one wanted to hear. The British knew this. He walked toward the table and pointed at one of the paint samples they had collected from the captured Allied plane. They chose this color not for beauty or luck, he continued. They chose it because it bends with the light. When the air is thick with haze, when the sun is low, the color becomes the air. The room fell silent again. No one argued, because there was nothing to argue about. The evidence was right there on the table: numbers, photographs, and sketches that made the truth impossible to ignore. One of the younger engineers, trying to make sense of it, asked softly, "But how could they have known? Did they test this before the war?" Schreiber nodded slowly. "They studied it. I am sure of it. This is not improvisation. This is understanding." The realization spread through the group like a slow chill. For years, the Luftwaffe had believed its strength came from precision, power, and innovation. Yet here, in this quiet airfield, the truth was humbling. The enemy had used not brute force, but nature itself. The scientists continued their work, now with a kind of reverence. They analyzed how color interacted with distance, how human eyes perceived contrast at different altitudes, and how the haze between the observer and the aircraft blurred outlines. They calculated that at an altitude of 2,000 meters, under low morning light, a pale pink or off-white plane could become nearly invisible to both the naked eye and early radar detection. The discovery was elegant in its simplicity. Visibility, they realized, was not only about brightness. It was about difference. If an aircraft's color and brightness matched the brightness of the sky behind it, the eye could not separate one from the other. The pinkish hue was not a mistake. It was the perfect balance between too dark and too bright, designed to disappear into the warm light of dawn. They began to test different shades, applying small panels of paint and holding them against the open sky. Every test confirmed what the British had already known. The trick was not in hiding from the sky. It was in becoming part of it. One scientist wrote in his notebook, his handwriting small and neat, "The effect increases between sunrise and 1 hour after. The reflection of red light upon pink surface makes edges vanish. Aircraft becomes cloud-colored. We thought it was absurd. It is science." That single line captured what all of them felt. For so long, the German engineers had dismissed the strange reports from Allied airfields. They had mocked the idea of painting planes in soft or bright colors. Yet now, with their own eyes, they had seen that absurdity transform into invisibility. By the afternoon, the tables were filled with sketches and diagrams. Rays of light drawn in pencil showed how atmosphere bent color. Small dots marked altitudes and angles. One drawing, simple but powerful, showed a side-by-side comparison, a gray plane against the blue of midday and a pale pink plane against the golden light of morning. Beneath it, someone had written, "Gray is for noon, pink is for dawn." The tone of the room shifted from disbelief to respect. These men were not just building machines anymore, they were studying the language of light. One of them said softly, "They did not build a plane that hides. They built a plane that belongs to the air." As the day went on, they took turns stepping outside to observe the sky. They watched how the light changed from 1 minute to the next, how colors deepened and faded. For the first time, they looked at the world not as soldiers or engineers, but as students of the sky. Every layer of cloud, every shimmer of light on the horizon, suddenly felt like a clue they had ignored for too long. When evening came, the group gathered one last time around the pink aircraft resting in the hangar. The color now looked dull and tired under the electric lamps. Yet they all knew that when the sun rose again, it would return to its ghostly brilliance. Schreiber stood in front of it, his voice quiet but steady. "We used to think we were fighting machines," he said. "But what we are really fighting is understanding." They understood the light before we did. The men nodded, some slowly, some with heavy hearts. Their notebooks were filled with data and sketches, but beneath the science lay something deeper, a realization that knowledge itself had become a weapon. As the generator hummed and shadows stretched across the hangar floor, Schreiber looked once more at the pale aircraft. "What we thought was absurd," he said softly, "was science." Outside, the evening air was still. The last light of the day touched the edge of the horizon, painting it with a faint blush of pink. For a moment, it was as if the sky itself was reminding them of what they had just learned, that invisibility did not come from power or speed, but from harmony with the world above. And that lesson, though simple, carried with it the quiet weight of defeat. It began with silence, the kind that settles after a great noise has passed. The hangar was almost empty now. The sound of footsteps echoed softly on the concrete floor, and outside, the evening wind moved slowly across the grass. Inside, the pink-painted aircraft sat still, a quiet reminder of everything they had just learned. What had started as curiosity now felt like a confession. The Luftwaffe engineers and pilots who remained were no longer talking loudly or arguing over data. Their voices were calm, thoughtful, and low. Every man in that room understood something had shifted, not just in their work, but in their view of the war itself. The discovery of the pale pink paint had peeled away more than layers of color. It had exposed the truth about why they were losing. One of the senior engineers, Muller, stood near the aircraft's wing, tracing its smooth surface with the back of his hand. He looked tired, not just from work, but from the weight of realization. "We always believed we had the advantage," he said quietly. We thought our machines were perfect, our pilots the best. But he paused, searching for the right word. They see differently. Across the hangar, a test pilot named Adler leaned against a wooden crate, his flying jacket half unzipped, his face shadowed by the fading light. He had been the one to fly the pink aircraft during the first test at dawn. His voice broke the silence that followed Muller's words. They mastered invisibility, he said. Not with technology, but with understanding. The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Every man there felt them. Adler went on, his tone thoughtful. When I was up there this morning, climbing through the haze, I looked back toward the ground. For a moment, I saw the shadow of the plane vanish into the light. It was like flying inside a dream. If I did not know it was real, I would have thought I had become part of the sky itself. And then I realized it was never about being faster. It was about being unseen. Schreiber, the lead scientist, looked up from his notes. He nodded slowly. That is it. They used light the way we use armor. They understood the nature of sight itself. While we were busy making our machines stronger, they were making theirs disappear. The realization struck deeper than any defeat they had felt before. This was not just a loss of ground or airspace. It was a loss of belief. For years, they had believed that German precision, design, and willpower would carry them through. But this pink paint, this quiet trick of light, showed them something different, something more powerful than steel or fire. The Allies were not just fighting the war with machines, they were fighting it with understanding. Outside, the sky had turned a dull gray blue. The day's last light fell on the aircraft, making it glow faintly, almost like it still belonged to the dawn. The men stared at it in silence. None of them had expected to feel this way. The color that once made them laugh now filled them with unease. Muller finally spoke again. "Do you remember how we laughed when we first saw it?" he asked, forcing a small, bitter smile. "We thought it was childish. We thought they had painted it that way by mistake. And yet, while we were mocking it, they were watching us from above, clear as day. We were blind, not them." There was no anger in his voice, only sadness. It was the sadness of realization, the kind that comes when pride is replaced by truth. Adler nodded, his eyes distant. "They turned the sky into a weapon," he said. "And we never saw it coming." A long pause followed. The wind outside whistled through the gaps in the hangar doors. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hummed. It was as if the world itself had slowed to listen. Schreiber closed his notebook and spoke softly, almost to himself. "It is strange, is it not? We have built engines that can climb higher, bombs that can destroy cities, and yet, what defeats us is a color that blends with the morning." One of the younger scientists looked up, his face pale. "It is not just the color," he said quietly. "It is what the color means. They are not guessing anymore. They know the sky better than we do." That thought settled over them like fog. It was not only about aircraft anymore. It was about a way of thinking. The Allies had reached a point where science and instinct worked together. They had learned to see the world not as soldiers, but as observers, students of the environment. Every shadow, every reflection, every change in light had meaning. The Germans had been building power, the Allies had been building understanding. It was this difference that hurt the most, because in that moment, they knew it could not be undone. Knowledge, once found, could not be lost again. Outside, a few other pilots arrived, drawn by whispers of the test flight. They walked around the aircraft, touching the pale surface, asking questions. The answers they received were simple, but each one felt like a quiet blow. They realized that the war they were fighting was no longer only about engines or firepower. It had become a war of perception, of seeing and not being seen. As the sky darkened, Schreiber turned to Adler and said, "Do you think we can use this?" Adler looked at him, then at the pink aircraft behind them. He shook his head slowly. "Maybe," he said, "but it will not change what it means. They were ahead of us long before we even knew this color existed." No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. The sound of the evening wind grew louder, filling the space where their confidence used to live. In the distance, The faint echo of an air raid siren rolled across the horizon, a reminder that the war was still going on, that their cities were burning, and that time was slipping away. Yet none of them moved. They stood there, surrounded by charts and paint samples, and felt the quiet truth settle deep inside. They had been proud once, proud of their machines, their science, their precision. But pride had blinded them. The enemy they feared had not only outbuilt them, they had outthought them. The pink plane was more than a strange experiment. It was a message written in the language of light. You never saw us coming. As the last glow of sunset faded into darkness, Schreiber whispered, "Perhaps the greatest power is not to be seen at all." The others nodded silently. The arrogance was gone now. In its place was something else: respect, humility, and the quiet understanding that the enemy they fought had already mastered what they were only beginning to see. The war outside raged on, but inside that hangar, a different kind of battle had ended. The battle between belief and understanding. And in that silence, under the faint shimmer of the pink-painted wing, they finally realized that invisibility was not a trick of color. It was a state of knowledge, one they had learned too late. It was over. The war that had once filled every sky with thunder now ended in a quiet that felt almost unreal. The airfields that had roared with engines and voices were now silent fields of dust and rust. The wind carried no orders, no fear, only the sound of grass moving where once machines had stood in proud formation. At the edge of an abandoned runway in northern France, half hidden behind tall weeds, there rested a single aircraft. Its frame leaned slightly to one side, its metal skin dull from years of rain and neglect. The once absurd pink paint had faded into a soft gray-white, the color of early dawn. From a distance, it looked less like a machine and more like a ghost, something half remembered by the world, half forgotten by history. The men who had built it were gone. Some had been captured, some had vanished into the chaos of defeat, and a few had returned to quiet villages, pretending to start again. But none of them ever forgot this aircraft, this strange pink plane that had taught them more about themselves than any victory ever could. In the months that followed the war, Allied investigators walked through those same abandoned hangars. They found broken engines, burned fuel drums, and files filled with incomplete experiments. Among them lay sketches of a pink-painted Bf-109, notes written in hurried German script about light, haze, and reflection. One line stood out, underlined in pencil. "They do not hide from us. They vanish because they understand the air itself." No one knew who had written it. But those words felt like the voice of the entire Luftwaffe in the final days, a whisper of realization that came too late to change anything. The aircraft was never moved. No one bothered to take it apart or study it again. For a long time, it stood as it was, a small monument to human curiosity and defeat. Its pale color began to peel away, but in certain light, just before sunrise or just after sunset, it would blend perfectly into the mist. Pilots flying above would sometimes report seeing a strange shape on the ground that looked like it was made of air. But when they looked again, it was gone. If you had stood there then, in that silence, you would have felt the strange stillness that follows understanding. You would have seen that pink plane and known that it was more than an experiment. It was a symbol of what happens when pride meets truth. The men who built it had set out to imitate a secret. They wanted to copy the enemy's invisible power, to find the science that made Allied aircraft vanish from sight. But in doing so, they discovered something far greater and far heavier. They discovered that the enemy's strength was not only in machines or colors or clever designs. It was in the way they thought. The Allies had looked at the sky not as a battlefield, but as a living system. They had studied the way light moves, the way eyes perceive, the way air bends and reflects color. They had seen what others had ignored. And in that quiet French field, as the pink plane slowly turned to dust, the truth of that understanding still lingered. The sun rose higher, painting the clouds in the same gentle shades that once hid aircraft from sight. The color of defeat and discovery looked the same, soft, pale, and strangely peaceful. The air shimmered with heat, and for a brief moment, the the faded pink of the aircraft melted perfectly into the horizon. It vanished, just as it had been built to do. The story of the pink plane never became famous. It was buried under bigger stories of great battles, famous pilots, and cities that burned. Yet in the quiet notes left behind by those who had worked on it, there was a kind of poetry. They had been fighting to make themselves unseen, but what they really uncovered was the invisible truth about war itself. That understanding does not always come with triumph. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the moment when one realizes that the enemy was not only ahead, but right. Years later, a farmer clearing the field found pieces of the aircraft under the soil. A section of the wing still carried traces of the faded pink color, soft as the inside of a seashell. He showed it to a local historian who stared at it for a long time, unable to believe such a color could belong to a warplane. It looked too gentle, too human, too alive. The historian smiled quietly and said, "Maybe that is the point. It was never meant to look like war." And perhaps that was true. That color, once seen as absurd, had revealed more about vision, humility, and perception than any weapon ever could. It was a lesson painted not in steel, but in light. If you listen carefully, you can almost imagine the hum of its engines starting again. You can picture it rising slowly through the misty air, the world below turning gold with morning. For a few seconds, it would become invisible once more, perfectly matched to the light of dawn. And then it would vanish, as if it had never existed at all. They set out to imitate their enemy's trick of invisibility, the narrator's voice would say, soft and distant, but instead, they discovered why they had already lost. The sound of the engine fades. The wind takes over. The field returns to silence. And as the camera pulls back, the viewer sees nothing but an empty runway and a pale sky. No aircraft, no color. Only the lingering feeling that something is there, just beyond sight. The screen fades slowly to gray. The war is over. But the light remains.